Yes, would you ask Mrs. Dexter to come back in, please? Right, Mrs. Dexter, ready to carry on?
Yes.
Good, thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Miller.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Ms. Dexter, can I now take you back to your witness statement, please, at LFB 3032363, and I'd like to go to page 8 and look with you at paragraph 27. And there you say that you were present at the second meeting, that's of the Lakanal House Working Group, on the 28th of August 2013. Assistant Commissioner Steve Turek, who reported to me, gave a presentation on the RRO. His presentation included a contribution from information management colleagues who also reported to me about the problems of defining and identifying high-rise premises, given the absence of adequate and appropriate data, etc. I'll come back to that presentation in a moment. If we go over the page to page 9 and look at paragraph 28, or lower down the page, you say this. Dave Crowder from the Building Research Establishment, BRE, also gave a presentation on the key factors that influenced the Lakanal House fire development. It was a highly detailed presentation which made a very significant impression on me, as it detailed the actions taken in multiple refurbishment or improvement projects undertaken at Lakanal House that had the unintended consequence of diminishing the fire safety protections of the building. Now, against that background, let's look together at Dave Crowder's presentation. It's at LFB 3086101. Can we please have that up? You can see, there's the first page. It's dated 28th of August 2013, and it's called an LFIPA briefing. And it's given by Dave Crowder, who was the then business group manager of fire investigation at BRE Global. It's 38 pages long, and it explores in some detail the construction at Lakanal House, including the refurbishment work. And I just want to look at some slides with you by way of example. Can we go to page 16, please? Here is a slide on composite panels, which were installed at Lakanal. If you look at the photographs, there you can see the panel itself and the core, a foam insulation core. And the third bullet point down says no fire resistance. And the final bullet on the page, if you look down a little bit further on that page, says introduced during refurbishment 2006 to 7, replacing asbestos. And if we go to page 18, the next but one slide, suspended ceiling in common corridor, you can see under the gap, the pre-penultimate bullet point, ceiling panels did not support flaming. Timber structure and fuel above contributed significantly, introduced in the 1980s for central heating works. And then if we go to the conclusion slide at page 37, on in the report, the last 3 bullet points read, large number of issues crept in over a number of years, overall worsening of conditions through years of neglect, no one single factor sufficient to have caused death in isolation. Now, I've picked out some parts of a lengthy report there, but can you tell us in general, what was it about the presentation that had such a significant impression on you, as you say in your statement?
Two different things. Is it two different things? Maybe it might not be two different things. The first thing might be, and this will come from my prior experience as a local government officer, the impact of successive local government reorganisations on the responsibility of the building over time. So it had been the responsibility, I think, of an urban district council and then a local authority, and then the involvement in terms of various refurbished projects had been the responsibility of externalised parts of Southwark Council. Some of it remained the responsibility of in-house departments. So the general impact of local government reorganisation and contracting out made a big impression on me. The fact that some of the things that had been done to Lakanal House over time had been done for good reasons, so to improve the thermal efficiency of the building, to improve the safety of the building in terms of community safety, so doors, key control doors at the end of corridors or at the front door, that kind of thing. So they'd made a number of changes to the building which were about improving the security and comfort of the building, but in consequence had sabotaged some of the fire safety protection features of the building. So, for example, I think maybe the smoke control system was effectively sabotaged by some of the features they'd introduced in order to improve the security of the building. And then there was the list of the things that happened in the fire. So you showed a picture there of the suspended ceilings and the voids above them. And that's an example of a number of features of the fire which made a big impression on me. Probably first on my list was compartmentation. There were so many different aspects of what happened to the compartmentation or the absence of compartmentation in Lakanal that it's very surprising to me. So that's three sets of things really, isn't it? But they are the things that I recall now.
Yes. And were you impressed, not in a good way, but were you impressed by the realisation perhaps that the problems at Lakanal identified by the BRE in this report were not limited to that one building, but might be endemic across London?
Well, I don't think that David Crowder pointed us in that direction. I can't remember him doing that. But this was the second part of 2013, wasn't it?
Yes, August.
And I think you can see from the bundle attached to my witness statement that shortly after I was generating reports which gave other examples of the failure of fire safety features. So I think several of my reports have different collections of incidents that were known to London Fire Brigade where issues such as breach of compartmentation were an important explanatory factor in what happened in the fire. But they were all they were very different in nature, one to the other, but there are attached to several of the reports that are attached to my witness statement, pen pictures, maybe of 12 or 15 incidents in total where, as a result of fire investigation work, we were able to identify in a more accessible way for the audiences that I was aiming at, what had happened in those fires and why.
You mentioned the fact that you were impressed by the idea that the refurbishment work at Lakanal House had, in your words, sabotaged some of the fire safety control systems. Did you know already, or did you learn from this report, that in general there was a problem across London, possibly from refurbishments which might sabotage fire safety control systems in other high-rise buildings?
I don't recall that as being something that I learned from this particular presentation.
Right. Let me try it this way around. When you read this presentation, you didn't think, did you, that the problems identified by the BRE in this report were a one-off?
I didn't think that, no.
No. And if we go back to your witness statement again, please, LFB 3032363 at page 9, just picking up where we left off in paragraph 28. In the sixth line, you say it was clear that it had significant implications for local government more widely, as they were the bodies that controlled and often provided the building control function that should have contributed to preventing what had happened at Lakanal House. The presentation had a major impact on many of the actions that I subsequently directed or undertook, including, for example, action I took to make better use of fire investigation findings and the design of the audit tool issued to local authorities in January 2015, and you produced that as an exhibit. Now, we'll come on to discuss the audit tool and some of your other work in more detail a little bit later, but for the moment, my question is this. Did you ever stop to consider how and in what ways the information in the BRE presentation had operational and training implications for local crews as first responders at fires in compromised buildings?
I think the answer to that is yes, because either later in this report or in another report, I explained that I thought it was important that David Crowder's presentation was available to a much wider audience. And that included, but wasn't confined to, the borough commanders. And the borough commanders were, as it were, the line management chain for fire stations.
What, to your mind, were the implications for local crews, which this report prompted?
What were the implications for local crews? Well, we will already have said a number of things internally within the brigade by this time about the Lakanal House fire. I couldn't possibly itemise them for you, to you, but I make that point simply to emphasise that it wasn't a blank sheet of paper for the brigade at this point.
Sorry. You may have misunderstood my question.
Okay.
Forget process.
Yeah.
You look at the report.
Yes.
You think of local crews. What were the implications for station managers, watch managers of this report? What was it telling you that it had implications for their work?
That this building in particular demonstrated a wide range of faults which individually and collectively contributed to a disastrous fire, and that they were not predictable or reliably predictable in nature.
Why did you think that?
I think I thought that because of the way they combined in this fire. So I said this morning, I'm not recommending that anybody does this, but you could make a list of 10 things that commonly you find in fires as, things that go wrong or are the cause of things that go wrong. And that list might have really substantial big-ticket items, and it might have smaller, less significant items. And individually and in combination, they contribute to the nature of the fire and how it develops and what happens to the people. But I think the Lakanal House fire was the most multifaceted fire that I had come across. So, of course, London Fire Brigade had experience of, big, dangerous fires. But this fire seemed different in nature because of what at that time I felt was a fairly unique, or at least unusual, combination of factors which had ruined the building and which contributed to what happened in the fire. What
information, data, expertise did you draw on to conclude that what was present at Lakanal was, as you put it, a unique or at least unusual combination of factors?
The fact that I had not before Lakanal seen any fire which displayed as many sabotaging factors as we found at Lakanal House. And you already know that by this time, I was reading every single fire investigation report, so that might be an individual dwelling fire or be a more significant fire, but it was the length and combination of factors in this fire which seemed to me to make it exceptional.
Exceptional, but not impossible.
Well, it obviously wasn't impossible because it happened. No. Indeed.
No, quite. So, would it be fair to say that at the time you were impressed by this, and that the implications for frontline responders was that they might encounter a building which had unusual or exceptional features, which might perform in a fire in an unusual or exceptional way?
Yes, and that had already been identified in, I think, the coroner's Rule 43 letter. So I think in her list of issues for incident commanders, I'm not certain, but she had a list of 6 or 7 things which she felt were relevant to the subject of incident command, and I believe that was one of them. And so in that sense, we had already begun to work on it internally, and I think Gary Reason, possibly at this meeting or one shortly before or after, provided a report on what we were doing about the incident command actions required by the coroner, and included in that list was, you need to take action to ensure that incident commanders are clearer about the unpredictability of some factors in some fires.
Right. Well, we will come back to that answer, perhaps with you, perhaps with others. For the present on this, can we take it that, as at least of August 2013, just over 4 years after the fire, the LFB was not dismissing Lakanal as a one-off exception?
No, we weren't. No. I mean, many different things follow from that, Mr. Millett, but no, we weren't. No.
And was one of the learning points, just on your reaction to this document, that any frontline responder should not trust that the building in front of him or her complied with the building regulations?
No is the answer, is the very honest answer to that. What tipped me personally nearer to that position happened after I left the Brigade. So the Brigade prosecuted Southwark Council under the provisions of the RRO, and as part of that prosecution, in mitigation, Southwark Council told the court that they had since spent either 52 or 62 million pounds on improvements to their stock. And Lewisham Council, in relation to, I always get it confused, is it Marine Tower, where there was a high-rise fire and again there was a prosecution? They'd spent 18 million pounds on improvements to their stock as a result of these respective incidents. But I'd left the Brigade by then. But, the idea that Southwark had to spend 52 or 62 million pounds on fire safety improvements to their stock, sitting in my own home, by that point, I was tipping nearer to, well, I'm just not sure how reliable this assumption is.
Did it ever occur to you that crews needed to be alerted expressly to this potentially widespread risk that high-rise buildings across London were not compliant with the building regulations and couldn't be trusted to perform reliably in a fire?
Mr. Millett, I'm simply not in a position here now to say that didn't happen in any form before this presentation. It's not the case that we did nothing between 2009 and 2011 or 2013. You've already seen the Lakanal House Action Plan, and I just can't be reliable today about whether that in fact happened.
I mean, let me put it more bluntly. When you got this presentation from Dave Crowder at the BRE at the end of August 2013, was your reaction to say, gosh, this building was horrendously non-compliant, we better tell all frontline responders so that they don't assume that the building in front of them is compliant? We better roll that out. Did that occur to you at the time, is the question?
No, it didn't occur to me at the time, but But a learning point that embraces that was there in the action plan for incident commanders,
Right.
and to that extent had been taken forward.
Right, as a learning point, developing that, was any thought given to, just at this point, any thought given to the interactions between the fire safety department and operational crews, and whether the dialogue between the two needed to be enhanced in order to make sure that operational crews could see what you could see?
I can't tell you with any confidence. My answer definitely isn't emphatically yes, we did. But we were beginning to have discussions, and they may already have started by this time, but I simply can't recall, but it'll be in record somewhere. We were beginning to have discussions about the interaction between fire safety audit work as performed by fire safety regulation and 72D work as performed by fire station staff. And the need to bring those closer together and to make the whole better than, you know, what up in for a long time had been two different constituent parts. But I can't date that, if I'm honest.
There was actually my next question, and you've answered that, and that's helpful. But we touched on that earlier this morning, where you told us that you'd seen reports to you about those interactions. And you can't date those. But you say it's after August 13. Is that right?
No. Was it after? I can't remember whether it was after. You mean the reports to my Directorate Management Board?
You mentioned the board this morning to which those reports were made.
I can't remember. I can't put it down to 2013. I'm afraid. I'm sorry.
Right. I mean, can you offer us anything else while you're sitting there to identify these reports, or how the LFB might be able to find them?
There's definitely one in my bundle. I'm really happy to provide the details.
Right. Well, if that is the case, then I'm quite sure that can be identified. Now, let's just look further at the Lakanal House working group and correspondence with the DCLG again. Can we look at the minutes of the August 2013 meeting of the working group? We'll find those at LFB 3032115. Now, there it is, and you can see the members are present, and the brigade officers present include you this time, with Gary Reason and Steve Turek and John Johnson from Committee Services, and the guest was Dave Crowder, misspelt but nonetheless present at BRE. And then item 2 is headed Overview of Fire Safety Regulatory Reform Order, RRO, agenda item 3. And we saw that on the agenda when we looked at it. The Assistant Commissioner of Fire Safety Regulation gave a presentation to the working group regarding the RRO and fire safety in residential blocks and answered questions from members. You see that. Now, looking a bit further down the list, during discussion, the working group drew up a list of issues for possible future consideration as follows. And I just want to look at 3 of those topics under the bullets there and just explore with you the basis of the working group's desire to investigate those topics. Starting with the second bullet point down, it says the regulation of leasehold properties within high-rise buildings, how landlords are dealing with leaseholders making modifications to doors, interior walls, etc., which potentially compromise the fire safety of buildings. And then if you look at the we'll look at the next one in a moment. Just pausing there, why was it that the working group wanted to focus on that area?
I imagine because it was a feature of Steve Turek's presentation. So I know that the Fire Safety Regulation Department regularly encountered issues associated with leasehold properties in high-rise buildings, and in a number of boroughs, for example, we're in discussion with significant housing providers about how to deal with that. So I imagine it was the feature of, I can't remember, I remember the fact of Steve's presentation, but not the detail, but I imagine it was in Steve's presentation.
Now, the third bullet point says the need for a recognised government standard for competent persons carrying out fire safety preventative measures. Why did the Lakanal Health Working Group consider it important that that was given future consideration?
Reading it here, it strikes me as odd wording. Competent persons. I don't remember.
And we know that a competency council had been set up in 2011 for fire risk assessors.
Yes, but that doesn't quite say that, does it?
No,
Which
it
is
doesn't.
why I was struggling with the words.
No, it doesn't, which is why I'm asking the question.
Yes.
There are two things. First of all, the need for a recognised government standard as opposed simply to market or trade regulation. And competent persons carrying out fire safety preventative measures doesn't quite tell you whether it's the fire risk assessor or the responsible person. Can you help with that?
I can't. I'm puzzled by the word.
Were you and Assistant Commissioner Cherrick aware of the Fire Safety Federation and the guide to choosing a competent fire risk assessor at this point?
Tell me again what FSF was.
Fire Safety Federation. Fire Sector Federation.
Yeah, I might have referred this morning to the Fire Protection Association, but I think they were at least closely aligned with FSF, or one may have become the other. So I think the answer is yes.
You were?
Steve was undoubtedly more familiar with it than I was.
Right. I may have misled you as to the date. I think, in fact, the Competency Council criteria were published in 2013, but earlier in the year. Do you know whether anybody considered that document and its fitness for purpose?
I don't.
At that time, you don't. Fourth bullet point down, the need for further guidance to the RRO on the definitions for A, parts used in common areas, and how the RRO is intended to operate where the responsible person does not have total control over those common areas, and B, a window installed under the fencer scheme, as the current definition does not stipulate whether composite systems with supporting frames are included. The supporting window panels at Lakanal House were not fire resistant and greatly influenced the spread of fire. Do you know what instigated that issue as a possible topic for the Lakanal House Working Group's deliberations? Why was that on the list?
Well, I think B was on the list because the failure of composite systems at Lakanal House was... Oh, yeah, sorry, as per the second half of that, the supporting... B was because the issue was a feature of the Lakanal House fire, and A, parts used in common. I admitted this morning to struggle to bring that to the front of my mind, and I'm not in any better place now, I'm afraid. So I thought it was to do with doors and door frames, potentially, but I could be 100 miles off the mark.
Right, and there had been, of course, by this time, discussions with Louise Upton at the DCLG on that very point. We may come back to shortly. Before we leave these minutes, the sixth bullet point says, if you go down the page...
Yes.
That I'm sorry. It's I'm so sorry. If you turn the page, I'm looking at the agreed parts.
Okay.
If you look at that, we go to a list of bullet points there. There are 6 in all. The fifth one, not the sixth one, I'll come to that in a minute. The fifth one says, the chair of the working group writes to the chair of the strategy committee, A, outlining the list of issues drawn up by the working group as above in order to clarify what areas the committee will consider in its expected review of current fire safety legislation. What was the strategy committee's expected review of current fire safety legislation? What was that?
That is a reference to the fact that the strategy committee had asked for a report, an informative report about fire safety legislation. Tell us what fire safety legislation there is, and tell us about any issues that arise from it. Tell us about its relationship with other relevant pieces of legislation. So it was, and I simply can't remember whether by this time I had begun to surface the proposition of an outside but in my own mind, that's where it was heading.
And the sixth bullet point says the chairman of the authority be consulted as to the possibility of him writing to the Fire Minister to follow up the Commissioner's letter of the 11th of December 2012 and to raise the various issues still outstanding. Now, we saw Commissioner Dobson's letter of December 2012, didn't we, earlier, which raised the question of external walls and the scope of the RRO. And there was a reply received from Louise Upton on the 6th of February to that letter, which we've also seen. Do you know why the Lakanal House Working Group wanted to follow up on that correspondence?
I think because we made that correspondence available to them, and They said, this isn't very satisfactory, is it?
Right. So there'd been a gap from February to December. From February to August. And is it the case that the authority was unsatisfied or dissatisfied either with what the DCLG had been saying and wanted further work done?
The working group was certainly dissatisfied,
Right.
yes.
Yes. Can we then go to your witness statement at page 11? Moving it on a month or so into September 2013, at paragraph 35, you say, in September 2013, I presented a report to the Strategy Committee that invited it to consider where it wished to focus its work. The report referred to many of the topics referred to elsewhere in this evidence, including the adequacy of the legislative framework for fire safety, lessons from Lakanal, building information, fire safety risk targeting, fire investigation, etc. This was part of my ongoing endeavour to give fire safety issues a higher profile. The committee decided to prioritise its focus on three topics, which were 1, fire safety legislation and regulation, 2, the collection and use of data, and 3, equalities issues. Now, you say that you had an ongoing endeavour to give fire safety issues a higher profile. A higher profile to whom?
Anybody I could persuade to listen.
Right.
But within the brigade and outside the brigade.
Thank you. And why, in your view, was fire safety not a top priority, the top priority, within the LFB at the time?
We didn't have a top priority within the brigade at the time. But I think I said somewhere possibly in my statement or in one of the reports, it was difficult to interest people in fire safety. You know, on the face of it, it didn't seem as interesting a topic as firefighting. I think fire safety historically was overshadowed by firefighting and interest in firefighting. You know, if our members wanted to talk about fire brigade business, it was about fire stations and firefighters and less about fire safety. And that was true in the boroughs as well, even though they had fire safety responsibilities. It was difficult to engage people, certainly outside our organisation, in fire safety, even where they had fire safety responsibilities. And it didn't, in my opinion, get a fair press internally either. So once I became Deputy Commissioner and saw more about the Fire Safety Regulation Department, it was self-evidently deserving of more airtime and more attention. And I endeavoured to make that happen.
Did you think ever about trying to promote some kind of structural change so that the intelligence within the fire safety department or group, or fire safety regulation department or group, on the matters that you've identified in your statement here, became familiar to frontline responders, operational firefighters?
Well, because you asked me about this before lunch, over lunch, I was, thinking, well, if I had wanted to say something to the front line about Brian Martin's clarification of the building regulations in relation to external spread of fire, what would that have been? And I couldn't work it out over lunch. I'd need to give it some more time and thought. But I did want the front line to be more aware of fire safety issues, but we also wanted incident commanders, in particular, to be better equipped in the light of what had happened at Lakanal. So I just can't today put my finger on how would that all have, in what way would that have distilled into what went to the front line? What would we have wanted them to do differently that would not have been, as it were, orchestrated by an incident commander at an incident? And you've raised these questions with me today, and I don't quite know what it bears some thinking about, and I'm not able to do that today.
Well, you posed a rhetorical question. Let me pose a practical answer. How about telling all frontliners in London, all station managers and watch managers in London, that when they turn up to a high-rise building which is overclad, there is a very significant risk that it might catch fire and there'll be fire spread in an unexpected way, and to look out for it?
Well, look, station managers, by definition, were also incident commanders. And so we were doing that in the sense that we were saying to them, look, you need to be aware of the risk of unpredictability. And there's a whole body of experience and policies and training associated with that, which Peter Cowap and Gary Reason and Dave Brown will be able to tell you a lot about in a way which is much more significant than I can.
So you raised the question you were thinking about over lunch.
Yes.
What's the answer to it? And I'm just positing an answer. Tell the frontliners that cladding on high-rise risks burns out of control, unpredictably, and very rapidly.
Does it on all buildings, Mr. Millett?
You saw it at Lakanal.
Yes, but
and you asked the question rhetorically. I'm trying to put to you an answer which I'm inviting you to comment on.
And I'm doing my best to comment on it, but I'm not sure I've learned as a result of the work that I did, or close following of the inquiry, that all cladding is inevitably a serious fire risk. I don't know that I've learnt that. If maybe it all is, but I'm just not sure. And London Fire Brigade has a responsibility to be thoughtful about what it does, and to make sure that if it's going to warn people of something, that it's well-founded. And I think during the post-Lakanal period, where we were, for example, preparing the communications plan, one of the things that I was anxious about was conveying to every high-rise liver in London that their building was inherently unsafe, when that's not where the evidence that we had at that time pointed us. So, hundreds of thousands of people live in high-rise blocks in London, and they're not all inherently unsafe. And we had to be thoughtful about, what was accurate and based on evidence, and should be openly, frequently, freely conveyed, and what needed to be slightly more careful and more thoughtful.
Now, your September report to the Strategy Committee is at LFB 3037166. It's dated the 9th of September 2013, as we can see. And the summary is on the screen in front of you. And it says, the new chair of the committee has expressed the desire that the committee should have a discussion about its future work programme and priorities. The chair is concerned that the committee should focus on strategy rather than detailed delivery issues. This report sets out some suggestions for discussion by the committee. The emphasis is on reports with a strategic theme, either under the umbrella of the London Safety Plan or setting out policy issues concerning the authority's current work and legislative powers and responsibilities. Now, that's the summary. If we go to page 3, we can see the workload, or the proposals for the workload, on that page under paragraph 5 there. You see there's a table, and the second item down in the table is fire safety legislation. And under topic, it says this: review of current legislation and identifying any gaps. Does the regulatory reform fire safety order work? Should LFB be a statutory planning consultee? Is there more LFB could do under current building regulations on policy objectives? For example, sprinklers. Why did you consider the fire safety legislation, in the way you've identified there, should be an area that the strategy committee should be considering?
Because I thought the application of the RRO in practice raised lots of issues that the committee ought to spend some time on.
Right.
The Brigade had a legal responsibility in terms of the fire safety order in relation to buildings with a responsible person in London, and we had no idea how many they were or what they were or where they were. That just seems bonkers to me. DCLG didn't know either, of course, so we had the Fire Protection Act, which was pretty clear about which premises were covered, and then we had the RRO, which was much less clear about an unspecified number or distribution or height or use of the buildings covered by the legislation. I just thought it was very unsatisfactory. And I mentioned earlier that in the arrangements that I established to review the progress of intended prosecutions, there was a constant stream of issues. So there'd be a fire investigation, there'd be a desire to take action, and then we couldn't find a responsible person. It wasn't always easy. In fact, it was often jolly difficult. There were just lots of things I felt which were very unsatisfactory about it, based on my experience of managing the function and seeing, how easy is it to take prosecution action if that's what you're minded to do.
I see. So to get to the root of it, this wasn't a Lakanal specific concern. It was broader than that, and we touched on that before.
It was, yes.
Yes, I see. Now go to page 4. On that page, you see paragraph 6. Of the document. Following discussion with the chair of the committee, her preferences for priorities are: first bullet, a focus on fire safety legislation and regulation to include a review of current legislation, identifying any gaps, etc. This topic would be highly relevant to the work of the Lakanal Health Working Group. Now, was this the same as the strategy committee's expected review of current fire safety legislation referred to in the minutes of the meeting of the Lakanal Health Working Group we saw earlier?
Yes.
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 And then the third bullet point says a piece of work looking at equalities issues, which would include consideration of whether and when to apply for reassessment against the equality standard. A reassessment was due in 2011, but was deferred because of LSP5 preparatory work. What were the issues that you were considering, or you did consider, should be addressed in that piece of work?
I can't remember. I think I know what it wasn't, but I can't remember for sure what it was. Sorry, that's an unhelpful reply.
Well, no,
sorry, I can't remember.
You can't remember. You can't remember. Can you remember whether it was equalities within the LFB? In other words, inclusion and diversity within the employees, as between them and as between them and the organisation, or was it equalities issues in delivery of the functions of the LFB?
I think it was more the former than the latter.
Right. Now, let's go to LFB 30494140. We see at page 3 on that run of documents the minutes of the next meeting of the Lakanal Health Working Group on the 30th of September 2013. We'd seen the 28th of August minutes. We're now on the 30th of September 2013 minutes. You can see Valerie Shawcross was present, Maurice Hestia, Peter Thrusday, and you were there as the senior most brigade officer, yes?
Yes.
And then under item 1, notes of meeting held on 28th of August 2013 and matters arising, the minute lists issues or items which would form the part of the working group's future programme following clarification of the ambit of the strategy committee's review of fire safety legislation, I think. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes. And then we find the clarification, I think, is this right, at page 5, just help me. We find something called Appendix 1, which is referred to in that paragraph we've just looked at briefly. And here on that page is something that looks like a letter, which is a letter, so it looks like a draft letter. Yes. Strategy Committee Memorandum, Dear Val, and it's from, if you just scroll to the bottom of the screen page, if you just have that, it's from Councillor Sarah Hayward, Chair, Strategy Committee. If we go back up a little bit to the second paragraph, it says this: in consultation both with colleagues on the committee and officers, the main areas of Appendix A that will certainly be included in our discussions are, first bullet, the regulation of leasehold properties within high-rise buildings, how landlords are dealing with leaseholders, making modifications to doors, stroke interior walls, etc., which potentially compromise the fire safety of buildings. Second bullet, the need for a recognised government standard for competent persons carrying out fire safety preventative measures. And then it goes on, I understand that further guidance required to the RRO will be emphasised in the letter from the Commissioner to the Fire Minister, 26th September 2013. That's a few days before. While there may not be any further work required on this issue, if the government do not respond in an appropriate way, I will be asking for it to be included as part of our lobbying work, that the Strategy Committee will be receiving a paper on it. Now, the letter from the Commissioner that's referred to the Fire Minister, Brandon Lewis, we find at LFB 3032149. So this is a read across. And it's dated the 26th of September 2013 to Brandon Lewis MP from James Cleverly, who was then the chairman of the LFIPA, copied to Val Shawcross. Did you see this letter at the time?
Yes, I was probably involved in its production.
Right, okay. Do you think that it was before the meeting, given that the appendix to the minutes referred to it? Was it before the meeting, do you think?
I've lost focus. I don't know the answer to that. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Now, if we look at this letter on the second page, it says this. Sorry, second paragraph. It says this. In the course of their work, members have reviewed an exchange of correspondence between the Commissioner, yourself, and your officials, and have asked me to write to you again, pressing the matters of concern. Having reviewed the issues, I felt that the letter would be better sent by the Commissioner, who's best placed to articulate the detailed policy areas. However, I wanted to include a covering note to stress the political commitment of the authority to this process and encourage that the areas of concern highlighted are duly addressed. And then, if you look down at page 2, we come to the letter itself from the Commissioner to Brandon Lewis of the 26th of September. Now, before I ask you about that, can I just ask you about James Cleverly's letter? Or covering letter, was there a feeling either within the LFB or within LFIPA that Brandon Lewis MP or the officials within the department, DCLG, were unlikely to cooperate with or respond to the letter if it didn't have the political weight of the LFIPA behind it?
I don't think that would be the right construction, because I don't think it reflects the order of things. So it was decided, or the Lakanal House Working Group, as you've already rehearsed, asked the chairman, as he was, to write to the Minister because they were dissatisfied with the quality of the exchange earlier in the year. But from memory, when it came to drafting that letter, it was a dense technical letter. And so we had a discussion at the time, which may be via email, about whether it was a letter for a politician to send to a politician, or whether it would be better for the then chairman, James Cleverly, to write to Brandon Lewis and say, look, you know, these are detailed technical matters that I've asked the Commissioner to itemise to you, Brandon Lewis. because we've already had a go with officials and not got very far. But I just want you to understand that he's doing so with, with my very active support.
Yes, I mean, in a nutshell, is this the position that, as you put it earlier in your evidence, you weren't exactly pushing at an open door with the department, and therefore you wanted the full heft of James Cleverly behind you?
Yes.
Right. Now, let's look at the Commissioner's letter, page 2. It's on the screen, 26th of September 2013. Did you have a hand in drafting this letter?
I think so, yes.
Yes. And, excuse me, the first 2 paragraphs of the letter set its context, namely the work of the Lakanal House Working Group. And if you look halfway down the second paragraph, in the 4th line, it says this: whilst my first letter received a reply from one of your officials, Ms. Louise Upton, in February, that's the 6th of February 2013 letter we looked at, members have reviewed that exchange in the light of the outcome of the inquest and the Rule 43 letters issued by the coroner. They feel that there remain issues to be addressed. The issues covered by my letter and Ms. Upton's response were, and then the first bullet point on this page, and indeed to the bottom of the page, set out the LFB's request for guidance on the operation of the RRO in relation to common parts and how the RRO is intended to operate where the responsible person doesn't have control over features affecting common parts. I summarise. Then you can see it says this. In her reply, after the italics, in her reply, Ms. Upton explained that the department had no evidence to suggest that the order was intended to apply generally to the structure of a block of flats because it would be artificial to delineate domestic premises in such a way that it excludes the structure, such as external walls around a flat. She added that the department believed this to be the case, regardless of whether the structure is, in property law terms, comprised within the lease or tenancy of the flat, because, considering the variety of possible arrangements and the extent to which various combinations might apply in any one building, the results are anomalous. She further added that she therefore did not consider that the order could have been intended to apply in this way. And then it goes on. Members of the authority have studied this response. They think that it is reasonable to expect the DCLG should be authoritative on the policy intention. But leaving that to one side, with the best will in the world, it is hard to penetrate what this means. And the evidence of the Lakanal fire and our wider fire safety work in London is that it is an issue that is significant and that deserves further attention. It is accepted that the department has, over the years, funded work which was intended to provide clarity, but it remains a confused landscape which is too important not to resolve. Now, I read that to you at length, partly because people need to see the letter and the concerns, but also because there's a question. Given the Fire Safety Department's investigations into external wall panels and cladding and the risks of external fire spread presented thereby, and given also the mention of Lakanal in this letter, the fire at Lakanal House here, would it be fair to assume that this was the driving force behind this request for further guidance?
Lakanal House?
Yeah, the concern and investigations into external wall cladding, panels and cladding, and the fire at Lakanal House.
Lakanal was absolutely the...
Yeah.
Without Lakanal House, this letter would not have been written.
Right.
Yes.
Despite the fact that you had concerns anyway.
On a wider basis, yes.
You had these penumbral concerns around Lakanal, but Lakanal, is this right, was the catalyst for writing letters like this, or this letter itself?
Yes.
Yes. Now, given the lack of clarity in Ms. Upton's response, which is faithfully reproduced in the paragraph I've just read to you, just under the italics, do you know why it took 8 months for the LFB to ask for clarification of what Ms. Upton meant?
Because we knew, because as I said earlier in the year, we didn't think we were going to make progress with DCLG on this, and it was helpful for me to be reminded there that that the inquest and the Rule 43 letters provided both the impetus and the opportunity to, as it were, have another go.
Indeed, and perhaps let's pick that issue up in the letter. If we go to page 3, at the very bottom of page 3, you'll see that the letter continues. It deals with the Brigade's request for further guidance in relation to the operation of functional requirement B4. And then it says this, underneath the bullet point. Ms Upton provided comments in response to this recommendation with reference to the existing guidance given in the BRE publication BR135, Fire Performance of External Thermal Insulation for Walls of Multi-Storey Buildings. However, you will be aware that this is a subject that the coroner addressed very fully during the inquest and was one of the specific issues detailed in the Rule 43 recommendation issued to DCLG. In DCLG's response to the coroner's recommendations, there is confirmation that research work had been commissioned which would feed into a future review of this part of the building regulations. It would therefore be helpful to understand the progress of this research and the timescales for reviewing this aspect of building regulations. And then, if we look at the second bullet point on page 4, there is a repeated call there for guidance on fire risk assessor competency, and this letter noting that no response had been received at all from the DCLG. And then the last paragraph. I expect that this will feel like we're going over old ground, but members of the authority are extremely keen to ensure that no matters of concern are neglected or left unresolved. It seems to them that concerns set out in my letter remain to be more finely addressed, especially as the inquest made very clear the need for clarity and guidance for residents and responsible persons of high-rise residential buildings. The purpose of this letter is to invite you to look at the issues raised previously and to take a view about whether it would now be possible to take some more vigorous action in response to them. Now, would it be fair to describe that last invitation and the lengthy passages I've read to you as an extremely polite kick up the DCLG backside?
Yes.
Now, Brandon Lewis replies, and he does so at LFB 3058999, and he writes to James Cleverly on the 16th of October 2013, and if we look at his response to the specific requests, he sets out the substantive responses, and he says this: if you go to the third paragraph down, on the question of guidance on the operation of the RRO, he says, in respect of the revised guidance for sleeping accommodation, we consider that LACORS and LGA fire safety guidance documents tailored to the specific needs of housing providers are appropriate to assist those responsible for ensuring the safety of residents and others in multi-occupied buildings to compliance with the provisions of the Fire Safety Order and the Housing Act. We make both documents available on the fire safety pages of the government's website. And if you look at the final paragraph on this page, which is the question about the functional, the guidance on the functional requirement B4 of the building regulations, he says, we have also commissioned a range of research to inform a future review of the buildings regulations, Part B. The Chief Fire Officers Association and others are involved in the research programme to support the next iteration, and individual fire and rescue authorities will have the opportunity to feed in comments at the consultation stage. We plan to publish a new edition of Approved Document B in 2016-17. And then over the page 2, in the second paragraph there, you can see that he says, finally, your letter notes that the London Fire Brigade did not receive a response in respect of the recommendation that the government provide guidance to the responsible person on how they might assess that the risk assessor is competent to carry out a suitable assessment of the risk in complex and high-rise premises. Fire Sector Federation published in February 2013 the competency criteria for fire risk assessors that had been developed and agreed by the fire safety sector. These criteria, which have been adopted by a number of certification bodies, was published alongside guidance for responsible persons looking for help in finding an independently certified competent fire risk assessor to help them comply with their duties under the Fire Safety Order. The guide is available on the Federation's website, and my department has, along with the Chief Fire Officers Association, encouraged individual fire and rescue authorities to make it available to the public on their websites. Now, again, I've shown you great chunks of that without asking you a question. My question is, first of all, did you see this response at the time?
Yes.
You did. What was your reaction to it?
I wasn't surprised by it. So if you go back to the first page, Mr. Millett.
Yes, let's do that.
Where it talks about guidance for sleeping accommodation, that paragraph reflects government philosophy at that time.
Did you agree with it?
Which I would say was, well, we think somebody else should do it. So you'll see there are many examples of the DCLG and probably other departments in relation to other functions, statutory functions, but the DCLG, there was a big thing at this time generally about being sector-led. The sector can do it. We don't need to do it. The sector can do it, and that's altogether a better thing. We, via the Audit Commission, don't need to inspect anymore. The sector can do it, and so there was a big sector-led thing going on, and that seems to me to be an example of it. And then in relation to building regulations Part B, we're going to do it. It's it'll be in the post next week, but I'm not sure the letter has ever arrived. So it didn't make a substantial difference to my mind, but it will surprise you to know that I can be overly critical of these things. I didn't think it moved things further forward, but that would be my assessment of it.
So not surprised by it, but not impressed by it.
Indeed.
Right. Now, do you remember how, and it'll be a question for him when he comes, I suppose, but do you remember how Commissioner Dobson reacted to it?
Probably the same.
And what about the other members of the Lakanal House Working Group?
Probably the same.
Did anybody actually go and look at the the FSF competency criteria for fire risk assessors and actually make a judgment about whether it satisfactorily answered the issue that the Brigade had raised?
I don't know, but I'd be very surprised if the Fire Safety Regulation Department weren't involved in the work. So there were people through CFOA, for example, involved in fire sector federation work. But I didn't ask I didn't check that with anybody, as in, have you done that?
Did you or anybody else go and look at the Lay Cause Guide or the LGA Guide in the light of the reference here in the third paragraph and see whether they adequately address the questions that you wanted answered by government?
I'm reasonably sure that I had, not for the purposes of this letter, but as it were part of ongoing business, read the Lay Cause Guide and the LGA Fire Safety Guidance document.
Right.
Sorry.
In the light of this response, and this is now mid-October 2013, so more than 4 years after the Lakanal House fire, is it fair to say that the LFB's concern regarding potentially widespread use of non-compliant panelling and the obscurities relating to the RRO remained entirely unassuaged, at least by dealings with central government?
I'm sorry, would you ask me again? I'm just, I want to be certain that I properly take into account the first part.
Would it be fair to say that more than 4 years after the Lakanal House fire, the LFB's concern relating to potentially widespread use of non-compliant panelling on the exterior of high-rise buildings and the obscurity surrounding the RRO, at least in that respect, remained entirely unassuaged?
I think yes on the obscurity point. I think you're inviting me, in effect, to confirm that we had widespread concern about cladding, I think, and I think I've been slightly reluctant to do that, and I don't want to move away from that position.
No, I understand. I didn't say widespread concern.
I'm sorry.
I said concern about potentially widespread use of non-compliant panelling.
Yes, I think I have been on the side of cautious about that statement, right. and I still am.
Right.
And I could be wrong in being cautious, but that's how I feel about it.
Was the LFB left with the view that there remained, absent government intervention, a significant risk that combustible panels on the outside of buildings, high-rise buildings, might go undetected by building owners, leaseholders, or fire risk assessors?
This was 2013. Not that I'm aware of, for reasons that I explained this morning.
Did this letter communicate to you, when you read it, that the central government had yet done anything to obviate the risks posed by non-compliant external wall constructions on high-rise buildings?
From your reading of the letter to me, I don't think I've seen anything in there that would have that effect, no.
Was it your impression that the government had basically kicked most of your questions on the RRO and the building regulations into the long grass, so to speak?
I didn't come away from any of this correspondence with the view that they were highly motivated to take interesting new action.
Another delicate but nonetheless revealing answer. So thank you for the diplomacy, but I think we know what you're saying. In the light of that, did you or anybody else in the LFB consider taking matters into your own hands, for example, by writing to building owners and housing providers and asking them to check the specifications of their high-rise external wall panels?
No.
Why is that?
Simply because we didn't, Mr. Millett. It's hard sometimes to explain why you didn't think to do something that you didn't think to do, but no, it never crossed my mind.
Right. Did you give any thought to giving the government a slightly more strident and pointed message?
If you'd asked me that question at the time, I'd have said I didn't think this was going anywhere, and you know from my witness statement that I had plans, but they were longer term plans.
So we've got, on this letter, correspondence with the government whereby there is to be no forthcoming clarification either of the scope of the RRO on competency of fire risk assessors beyond the competency council criteria, and an unanswered question about B4 fire spread. In the light of that, did the LFB take any steps to educate operational crews when preparing both operationally and educationally for another high-rise fire?
Preparation for high-rise fires was an ongoing activity of the brigade. And I'm sorry, may I just go one stage back? I realise that whilst London Fire Brigade were sending these letters to DCLG, but as we've seen, not feeling that we got very far, it's quite possible that the LGA were doing something similar in parallel, and Ron Dobson would be in a position, I think he was an advisor to the LGA Fire Committee or whatever it was called, and he may well have, he may know that there was something more substantial happening there, although I wasn't aware of it.
You don't know?
I don't know, and I like to think that I would have known, but I just don't want to exclude the possibility that, Ron knew we weren't succeeding in London, but it doesn't mean that there weren't other people also having a go, and he was aware of that.
Yes, but you're speculating, aren't you?
I am, but only because, the LGA, in one sense, is the body that talks to government on behalf of local government.
Are you aware, from your own knowledge, of any discussions between the LGA and central government on these issues in 2013?
I'm not, no.
Now, turning to the development of the RRO report and the instruction of the BRE as a separate topic, can I take you back, please, to LFB 3049140 and go to page 5 again. This is back to the draft letter, Dear Val, from Councillor Sarah Hayward. The letter itself, there it is in Appendix 1 to the minute of the 30th of September 2013 Lakanal Health Working Group meeting. But let's look at the letter as sent. It's at LFB 00107-305, just to show people that it was actually sent, as opposed simply to being a draft.
Oh, this is a different letter, isn't it? This is isn't this the letter to which Sarah Hayward is replying?
Well, you're asking me a question. And
I'm sorry. I thought you were suggesting that this was, as it were, the final version of the one we've just looked at.
I was, but
I don't think it is, actually.
Well, if we go to page 3, I'm sorry, paragraph 3 of the letter.
Sorry, this is Val Shawcross's letter, or is this Sarah so this is...
yes, I'm afraid I don't know what's happened there. This is the...
This is Val Shawcross to Sarah. Yes.
That's right.
Yes.
Exactly. And it's an odd-looking document because it appears it appears underneath the LFIPA memorandum note paper, but it is a letter. Could you help me? Why is it in that form?
I'm sorry. In what?
Well, it's in the form of a memorandum to Councillor Hayward from Valerie Shawcross on LFIPA note paper. Maybe you don't know.
What? Normal business practice?
Right.
In our organisation.
I see. They're both LFIPA people, aren't they?
They are.
Right. One is Strategy Committee, the other is Lakanal House Working Committee, but they've both got LFIPA note paper.
Yes.
That's how they communicate.
Yes.
Yes, right. Now, just to remind you, if we go back to the letter to which I think this is a response, you are right. Let's just look back at it again. LFB 3049140, page 5. If we go to paragraph 3 in that document, you can see, and we read this before, I understand that further guidance required to the RRO will be emphasised in the letter from the Commissioner to the Fire Minister 26 September 2013, which we've now seen. And then it goes on, whilst there may not be any further work required on this issue, if the government do not respond in an appropriate way, I'll be asking for it to be included as part of our lobbying work that the Strategy Committee will be receiving a paper on it. I read that to you before. I'm reading it to you again in light of what we've now seen from the actual letter and the actual response. Can you tell me what was the Strategy Committee's view on whether Brandon Lewis MP's letter of the 16th of October 2013 by way of response to the 26th of September 2013 letter was appropriate?
I don't recall them having a view. I don't recall them being invited to have a view or having one.
Did the Strategy Committee push for lobbying work?
No, I proposed it to them.
Right. Did it ask for a paper on the RRO?
We promised a paper on fire safety legislation, you members. So it was a new committee with new members, and we promised them a report which attempted to describe the fire safety legislation landscape.
Right. Now, let's go to LFB 3086147. And if we look at this email chain, if we go to the email right at the very foot of page 1 and over to page 2, we can see that you sent an email to Ron Dobson on the 25th of October. And in fact, I think we need to start a little earlier than that. If we go to page 3, this is an email from you to Dobson on the 19th of October 2013, which is only 3 days or so after Brandon Lewis MP's 16th of October response to James Cleverly. and you say this: I'm working on a piece of work for the next strategy committee about the RRO. And just pausing there, was that the piece of work as a result of the strategy committee's dim view of Brandon Lewis's response?
No, I think I hope I've said, I'm not sure the strategy committee had a view. The Lakanal House working groups certainly did. And no, I don't think one was the product of the other anyway. I think it was. I think it was because. So this, we had a new chair, Sarah Haywood, a new committee, strategy committee, and officers went and met her in her office to talk about, what she wanted to do with the committee and what she wanted to prioritise. And we, or I, absolutely wanted them to receive a report about fire safety legislation and what we saw some of the issues and problems as being.
And you go on to say, when I look back over the last 3 to 4 years, I feel disappointed with myself that we haven't effectively enough marshalled our arguments about the effectiveness of the regulatory fire safety environment. Government have approached it in a piecemeal way, and we have responded on the grounds that they have set. But when you stand back and think about whether it all works, not just the RRO, but the way it works alongside Housing Act duties and responsibilities, and the separate structural fire safety regimes, including building control, you have to question whether we should go back to the drawing board. One of my own tentative conclusions was that a single regime for lots of very different classes of premises might be wrong in principle. And having concluded that, I was then a bit dismayed and a bit amused to find that Brian Robinson had written something similar in that Fire Futures stuff. I asked for a copy of a report which dealt with this idea, and when it arrived yesterday, Brian was given as the author with a contribution from Nick Collins. DCLG published an evaluation of the RRO in March 2009, but in truth this was much too soon, which the report itself acknowledges, and it is quiet on issues that since then have emerged as key issues and problems. Sue Budden was whispering in my ear about NOG money, that's National Operational Guidance money at CMB this week, much to SEB's annoyance, I think. But it has caused me to wonder whether there are grounds for taking a lump of that, up to 50 to 100,000, to commission a new national query, study of what works and what needs to change. We ourselves spend over 15 million a year on FSR, and it's difficult to know if that's all good value and effectively targeted. What do you think? Now, when you sent that email, what sort of study did you have in mind?
I wanted just to commission a piece of research to be undertaken by an external provider. So, if you work in another part of local government and you want somebody to review your SEN provision or do an organisational development study, there are consultants falling over you to do this work, Pricewaterhouse and Arthur Anderson and Ernst & Young. So they specialise in doing, reviews of issues and structures in local government. And I wanted some kind of, some clever people from outside the fire service to do a piece of research for us. And we would, as part of an open procurement process which we had, we would publish terms of reference saying these are the things we're interested in. Go away and study them and make a report back to us.
Now we'll come back after the break to look at the response that you got from the Commissioner the following week. Perhaps that's a convenient.
Is that the point you'd like to break?
Yes. Thank you.
All right. Well, we'll have a short break now, Mrs. Dexter. We'll come back at, please, 25 to 4. And again, don't discuss your evidence with anyone while you're away, please. Right, 25 to 4, please. Thank you. Yes, would you ask Mrs Dexter to come back in, please? Right, Mrs Dexter, ready to carry on?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr Millett.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. We were looking at your email of the 19th of October 2013 to Ron Dobson, which I read to you in full. I'd like now to look at the response from Ron Dobson the following week, the 25th of October. Can we go back, please, to LFB 3086147? And there it is. And he says this: I've been thinking quite a bit about this since your email. I think my conclusion is that I agree that we do have a hodgepodge of legislation that has been developed over many years and probably does not best serve all of those involved in dealing with safety in the built environment. I also agree that a wholesale review of this would be a good thing to do. However, I'm not convinced that it is for us to do alone, and it is certainly not for us to do alone on a national basis. However, I would be supportive of a collaborative approach between us and possibly London councils, the Mayor's office, and maybe others involved in the area. The funding for this is something that I have some ideas about, but I would prefer to discuss these rather than commit to them to email. I do, however, think that a consideration before we take this any further is where it might end up, particularly in an environment where government is only interested in reducing the legislative burden and certainly not on increasing it. One to discuss next week before it goes any further, I think. Thanks. Now, what did you understand Ron Dobson to mean in saying, as he does at the end there, particularly in an environment where government is only interested in reducing the legislative burden and certainly not on increasing it?
I think it's a statement of, as it were, recognised fact at that time, so that, the government had formally declared policies about reducing the burden on business, for example. And I think maybe the Public Affairs Strategy report, which you'll probably come to, refers to the government policy. I'm not sure this was formally declared policy, but the 1 in, 2 out, as it became. It started as 1 in, 1 out, and it became 1 in, 2 out. If you get rid of one item, or the other, you can have one new item if you discard 2 new items. So it was openly recognised that the government had a deregulating agenda, and certainly a reducing the burdens on business. Although I'm not sure that what I had in mind would have been more burden on business, but it may well have been more burden on public authorities, and that would have given rise to issues about funding as well.
Right. Let's look at your response to the email at the top of this page, page 2, just a little bit later that day. It starts at the bottom of page 1. Just to show you the timing of the email, which is at 19:31 on that evening. And if we go to the top of page 2, please, we can see you say this. OK, we should discuss further. This is the draft report that has been issued for the pre-meet with Councillor Hayward on Tuesday. It doesn't mention a study, but it does refer to questions about whether the current regime is fit for purpose. Towards the end, it says, also appearing on the agenda for the meeting of the committee is a draft of public affairs strategy. That paper reflects the analysis in this report that there are problems with the current regulatory regime which may well need changing. It notes that this would not be an easy objective to achieve, would likely take some years, possibly 4, and any campaign to achieve it would need to be based on some detailed legal and policy work to develop a model for a revised RRO that we would consider satisfactory. It would also need to consider the interaction of the RRO with other relevant legislation, including approved Document B and other building regulations, and the Housing Acts 1985 and 2004. I produced the attached report only last Saturday, and Ian and I discussed it during the week. As a result, we thought that if well put together, we might be able to sell a change to the regulatory structure under the general deregulation framework if we get rid of old ones and introduce a new, clearer and more functional new one, 1 in, 2 out rule. Bit of a stretch, but not impossible. So we have also added a further sentence to the Public Affairs report to that effect. Now, the draft report that you attached to that email is at LFB 3086144. And it's dated 12th November 2013, which was 2 days before the next Lakanal House Working Group meeting. But I think I'm right in saying it wasn't on the agenda for that meeting. Did you write this?
Yes.
You did. Let's look at the title, Fire Safety Legislation, Does It Work? Question mark.
So this was a draft.
Indeed, and it says draft
Yes.
in watermark across it.
Yeah.
But this is, am I right in thinking this is what you sent to Ron Dobson in your 25th of October response?
I can't be certain, but I think that if you say so, I accept that.
Right. Now, it has the title, Fire Safety Legislation, Does It Work? And the first paragraph of the summary reads, at its last meeting on 9th September 2013, the committee agreed a report, FEP 2117, setting out a forward work programme. One of the topics agreed was a focus on fire safety legislation and regulation to include a review of current legislation, identifying any gaps, etc. You see that? Now, skipping to the next paragraph, this paragraph is essentially an initial discussion paper which gives consideration to the scope of this review of fire safety legislation and seeks members' views on what issues should be included in the review. Now, in writing this draft, at least, what was your view as to whether the fire safety legislative framework was working or wasn't working?
More not working than working. So I think particularly out of Lakanal, but more widely, there was particular confusion about the interaction between the RRO and the Housing Act, for example. But there were many other issues as well. I've already said the work on prosecutions in particular highlighted many issues. We'd had a coroner's inquest in relation to, or there'd been a coroner's report in relation to a London fire death where the coroner was close to furious that even at the time of the inquest, the responsible person for the building, which was a private sector high-rise block, had still not been identified. It took us some time before we were able to do that. So there was a long list of things that we had encountered as a result of fires and prosecution activity and other enforcement activity that needed to be addressed.
Yes. Now, if the sentiments that you set out in this report, clearly you held them. Were there others in the LFB who shared the same views of the RRO?
Yes, there were. Yes. So in legal and democratic services, for example, they could see some of the problems addressed by these reports. There were colleagues in fire safety regulation who would certainly talk about the issues individually, but they may not then have added them up in the way that I did. But that's, in one sense, that's what you have senior managers for, isn't it? So yes, they were concerned about various combinations of the, as it were, the subheadings of the headline. Our public affairs person, Ian Wilmore at that time, who was closely involved in the drafting of the public affairs strategy, he was an experienced public sector lobbyist, and he could see what the problems were and what we were trying to do. And there was, it wasn't extensive, but there was some external concern. Well, I say it wasn't extensive, but I think housing providers in London, maybe via the high-rise forum, or maybe some of the meetings we had facilitated by London councils in the early days after Lakanal, they clearly felt vulnerable or unsure about aspects of what their responsibilities were and about the regime that was in place. And, yes, sorry, I'll finish there.
Page 11. We can go to page 11 in this document. In the last substantive paragraph of your report, at paragraph 43, you say, also appearing on the agenda for the meeting of the committee as a draft public affairs strategy. That paper reflects the analysis in this report that there are problems with the current regulatory regime which may well need changing. It notes that this would not be an easy objective to achieve, would likely take some years, possibly 4, and any campaign to achieve it would need to be based on some detailed legal and policy work to develop a model for a revised RRIO. etc. And you've seen that before, because the rest of it appears elsewhere. Now, the Public Affairs Strategy Report that's referred to in the first line of that paragraph is at LFB 3032342. And it's called Future Public Affairs Strategy, and it's also dated the 12th of November 2013. Now, this doesn't appear to be a draft. Is that right?
Indeed.
Right. Did you send this also to Commissioner Dobson, or not? We can't tell whether you did or didn't.
I can't recall.
Right. Can we go to page 3, please, and look at paragraphs 8 and 9? And under 8, which has the reference to the RRO there, approved document B and related legislation, you say this: the RRO has known flaws as a regulatory framework for fire services. The recent exchange of correspondence between the Commissioner and DCLG officials shows that there is vagueness in the existing regulations, for example, in relation to inspection of, quotes, common parts, close quotes, in blocks of flats, and that seeking clarification from government is not likely to be successful. The Brigade also experiences repeated problems in progressing investigations because fire officers do not have powers to compel witness statements or seize relevant documents. It's possible that progress might be made through formal guidance, but it's more likely that a revised RRO or replacement secondary legislation would be needed. This is not an easy objective to achieve, and would likely take some years, possibly 4, and any campaign to achieve it would need to be based on some detailed legal and policy work to develop a model for a revised RRO that we would consider satisfactory. We would also need to consider the interaction with the RRO with other relevant legislation, including approved document B and other building regulations, Housing Acts 1985 and 2004. And then you say, an internal LFIPA working group on this would seem a useful mechanism to consider what our priority objectives for change would be, and to put these into a form that could readily be incorporated in legislation or guidance. Now, again, I've read great chunks of this document to you because it's important that you see the context. But standing back from the detail, as you saw it, was there a risk to life presented by the defects in the RRO as it stood?
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry, I don't think I thought about that question at the time. But if you ask me now, the answer is yes.
Is it right that you didn't think about it in those terms at the time?
Indeed.
Right.
But if somebody had asked me the question that you just asked me at the time, I think the answer would have been yes.
Right.
It was simply not put to me in those terms.
No, I understand. I know it's a counterfactual to some extent, but if somebody had asked you that question at the time, could you tell them what those risks were?
That inadequate fire risk assessments were resulting in inadequate buildings, and in the event of a fire, the risk to life was realised in instances that were known to London Fire Brigade.
Can I just ask for your help on this? I mean, that suggests not necessarily that the provisions of the RRO are defective. It's just that they're not being properly carried out.
That's a very fair point, and that would have needed to be explored further. Yes, that is a very fair point.
Can I ask you this? We've seen many of these documents complaining that the RRO is defective. Did you ever get to the stage of listing the defects in the RRO as they appeared to the London Fire Brigade?
I think so. That is in one of the documents.
Well, then maybe we're going to see it at some point. But I mean, so far,
Indeed.
the debate's all been conducted at a very high level in these documents, with the exception of the correspondence with the DCLG, where certain fairly specific questions were put for comment.
I did, in fact, give you an example earlier, although it might not have presented itself as such. So the Brigade, when the change from the Fire Precautions Act to the RRO happened, the number of premises for which it was deemed London Fire Brigade had an interest under the RRO was estimated to have approximately doubled from 350,000 to over 700,000. But the 700,000 figure was largely speculative, probably well-informed speculation, but it was a view the Brigade came to about the number of premises covered by the RRO. But as I said earlier, there was no usable breakdown or understanding of whether that was 500,000 shops and 500 high-rise blocks, to use that as an example. So the composition of that was not available to the Brigade and had to be, and probably still is being, slowly accumulated based upon putting together myriad different data sources.
Is that a defect in the legislation or a defect in its application?
I don't know that I know the answer to that, but I feel that a piece of legislation where there is uncertainty about to whom it applies doesn't.
Uncertainty about whom it applies may relate to uncertainty in the construction of the legislation.
Yes.
So you don't know what it means.
Yes.
Or certainty, albeit there's certainty in the construction of the legislation, uncertainty as to how many people, or in this case, how many premises it applies to. But
I think for me, those issues needed to be explored further.
yeah, but one suggests you need to amend the legislation.
Yes.
One suggests you need to work out how to apply it properly.
I accept that, but this was contemplating what the outcomes might be without saying with certainty that is what they would be. So this was intended. This further work was intended to be informed by a very robust piece of research which would be undertaken outside the Brigade.
Yeah. All right, well, perhaps we better go on and maybe we'll get to a document of the sort you've identified later on. Yeah.
But I think the document that the witnesses identified, we've just looked at, in fact, we think. But to go back to that, we've seen two documents, the Fire Safety Legislation Does It Work draft document and the Future Strategy document that's on the screen, both dated the 12th of November 2013. The former is a draft. Was it finalised and sent to the Strategy Committee?
Yes, it was. So I don't think, for example, the final version had the "Does it work?" question attached to it. So
I think that's right.
yeah. Okay. So there were amendments, and I'm reasonably sure I made some amendments in response to comments offered by the Commissioner. But I think the report maybe has a list of the kinds of more detailed questions that I was referring to in response to the Chairman's questions.
But let's go back and look at that in a moment then. But just before I do, can I just ask you, why were you giving the Strategy Committee two reports covering essentially the same topic on the same day?
Why weren't they? I think, from memory, the Public Affairs report also dealt with issues which were not associated with fire safety regulation.
Right. Let's press on then, because we'll come back to the final version of the draft Does It Work document without the Does It Work
Yes.
in a moment. Continuing with the emails, if I can we go back to the email chain we were looking at before at LFB30s86147? And you can see the Commissioner's response to your email of the 25th of October 2013 at 7:30 or so in the evening. And if we go back to page 1, please, at the very bottom half of the page, we can see, even later in the evening, he comes back to you, and he says this is quite a significant report, and I can't do it justice reading it on my phone. However, I must admit that I am surprised, probably more disappointed really, that it could be dispatched to members without any discussion at CMB, or at least informally with me. It appears, though, from the comments attributed to them at the end, that it had been discussed with David Atkinson and Sue Budden. Even though even through scanning the report on my phone, I can see that the direction it is seeking to influence the members in is in line with the proposal I commented on this afternoon. And when I sent that email, I didn't have any inclination that this report existed, so I feel rather foolish. There are bits of the report that I don't think are accurate and others with which I simply disagree. But as it has now gone to members already, I don't suppose it's worth commenting now. You then respond a few days later, 3 days later, and you say at the top of the page, as I said I would, I've looked at this report again to see where it could be refined in line with your comments. In fact, there is in actuality nothing which seeks to influence members towards a national or even local study or review beyond the scope of the work of the committee itself requested. You'll recall that this piece of work was requested by Councillor Hayward / Julian Pinney. Paragraph 43 is the most outspoken statement. I'm just pausing there. I think I read that to you. But this is a straight lift from the Public Affairs report that was approved at CMB. Nevertheless, I've made some changes which are shown here. Are there specific things that you would like me to remove? Dispatch is not for a few days yet, and I'll tell Councillor Hayward that it's unfinished and will change further before dispatch. Now, just to try and get this chronology right, the document that you'd sent the Commissioner was the draft fire safety legislation does it work document.
I think that's what I gather from here.
Yes. But had he also, is he right that you had sent that out to the members?
Only informally to Councillor Hayward.
Right.
So it was still at a draft stage.
Okay, because he got rather cross about that. But in fact...
It was, and it was a fair cop.
Right.
It was extremely rare for him to be cross with me. I hope because I didn't give him many reasons to, but this was a rare thing.
Right.
But it had gone to Councillor Hayward as a draft and was absolutely still capable of being amended.
Okay, as you say, and then there were amendments, I think, to it, as we'll come to see in a moment. But what I want to ask you about is that it appears from this email run that there was a discussion about this report, or rather about the fire safety legislation report, as it became, offline. Is that right? Was there one?
I've looked. I can't remember.
Right.
Is that because you're reflecting on the words where it could be refined in line with your comments?
Well, did you have a discussion with Commissioner Dobson?
I don't remember. So you've drawn that sentence to my attention, and I immediately thought to myself, does that mean we met or he sent me something? But I can't remember.
Right. Do you know what his views were on the draft in general?
No.
Right. He says in his email that he thinks parts of it were inaccurate and some he disagreed with. Can you remember now what they were?
No.
No. Do you know what his own views were on the adequacy of the fire safety legislative landscape? But beyond what we've seen in the email.
No.
Right. Now, if you go to your witness statement, please, page 11, paragraph 36. You can see in the 8th line there, you exhibit the final version of the report for the Strategy Committee. And you say that it was entitled Fire Safety Legislation, Review of Current Legislation. And you produced it, I think, as RMD6. And you say it was a detailed report that aimed to provide members with an accessible insight into the scope and problems that ongoing fire safety work and the fire at Lakanal House had revealed, and which I felt the relevant legislation did not help. The report laid the ground for an independent study, which was subsequently undertaken by the Building Research Establishment and completed after my departure from the LFB. What was it about the legislation that you considered that the fire at Lakanal House had revealed?
Oh, Mr. Millett, I'd need to see the report again.
Let's do that. LFB 3086148. This is the track changed version of the draft we saw earlier. It's still entitled draft because it's got track changes on it.
Yeah.
This might help you. You can see what's changed, and the does it work was deleted, and in its place in the title review of current legislation was inserted. Do you know what the reason was behind that change?
I think the effect of the Commissioner's comments that we've seen seem to me to suggest that he would have preferred not to have been in a rush. That was obvious. But I also took from it the possibility that he believed it was overstated, and so
Right.
it was in response to that.
I see. Can we go to page 9, please, and look at paragraph 34? Under the heading, do the necessary tools and competencies for the task exist? We can see that you amended the report to delete the text based on the experience of the brigade. There is room for doubt. You can see what's deleted in the delete balloon there on the right. And then you've added some words in blue with the track underneath. However, although it is difficult to quantify, it seems highly likely to be the case that many London local authorities and other public bodies have since sharpened their focus and increased their investment in respect of their fire safety management responsibilities. The newly established high-rise forum has demonstrated a great deal of enthusiasm for better competence and better action. Why did you delete the line based on the experience of the brigade, there is room for doubt, when answering the question in the heading of the section?
For the reason I've just given, I took what I accepted what I understood to be a cue from the Commissioner that I needed to reflect harder on some of the phraseology.
Was it still, in fact, the case that the experience of the brigade had given you room for doubt, as you had first inserted in the draft?
There was room for doubt. Sorry, what was the question again, Mr. Millett?
Well, let me try it.
Sorry, no, you can try it the same way if you just repeat it, I think.
Yes. Was it, in fact, the case that the experience of the brigade had given you room for doubt?
Based on what I saw through the prosecution reviews, I think yes.
Right. And what was the basis for your belief that it was, quote, highly likely to be the case that many London local authorities and other public bodies have since sharpened their focus and increased their investment in respect of fire safety management?
What we were hearing through the high-rise forum, and I think also before the high-rise forum there'd been a series of meetings with London housing directors, certainly at the offices of London councils, and I attended a couple of those with Steve Turek, but so it would be a combination of that and the high-rise forum.
Right.
And sorry, and I can't remember the timing, but I also, in some of these reports, drew on contributions from the borough commanders. So the borough commanders were invited to send me information about their experience in their boroughs, working with them on high-rise housing matters, and so those things combined.
Now, we have the minutes of the Strategy Committee's meeting of the 12th of November 2013, at which this report, I think, was presented. Can we go to that? It's at LFB 30-42372. Indeed, these minutes show that both reports were presented. If we go to page 3, under item 8, Future Public Affairs Strategy, FEP 2166, report by the Deputy Commissioner. You see that?
Yes.
Was that you presenting the second of these two reports that we've looked at?
Do you mean the public affairs strategy?
Yes.
No, it was presented by the then public affairs officer.
I see. Sorry, when it says report by the Deputy Commissioner, that's your report presented by the public affairs officer.
Yes.
I follow. And then if you go to item 9 on the next page, page 4, fire safety legislation, review of current legislation, FEP 2167, report by the Deputy Commissioner and Assistant Commissioner, Fire Safety Regulation. Who actually presented that report?
I don't remember, but if it names us both, we probably did it together.
Well, again, it may be that the report was authored by both of you.
Yes.
But presented by Both of you? Or one of you? You don't remember?
Certainly sitting next to each other, slightly we both contributed, but I don't recall.
Right. It goes on. The report, which was welcomed by the committee, was introduced by the Deputy Commissioner, that's you, explaining that it was intended to provide a wide overview of the subject, and it tied in with the work of the Lakanal House Working Group. It was noted that the Department of Communities and Local Government had undertaken a review of the Fire Safety Regulatory Reform Order 2005 at a national level, and officers suggested it might be timely to replicate this on a London basis. After debate, the motion was made by Councillor Hayward that, 1, officers undertake examination in greater detail of all the areas listed in paragraph 3 of the report in the order of priority as listed. Now, just two things. The review that is said that had been undertaken by the DCLG at a national level, was that the 2009 review that we'd seen referred to in the report, or that you referred to earlier in your evidence, or was it something else?
I don't remember the 2009 review, but my recollection is that the RRO, the DCLG RRO review happened much more quickly after 2005. So I'm not recalling that it was as late as 4 years after the RRO. But I'm sorry, I can't recall now.
Right.
The 2009 reference.
Well, we'd seen a reference earlier today in one of your documents to that effect, but no matter. Which review was it? It was the first one, was it?
Yes.
Right. Now, the minutes say, as you can see, that the report was welcomed by the committee. What was their feedback? Was it broadly positive?
Brief but positive, yes.
Brief but positive. And it's clear from this update that the strategy committee were considering a study of the effect of the RRO in London rather than a review of the RRO's operation at the national level, which is, as I think, what you had originally proposed to Commissioner Dobson. Why was that?
Why was it London?
Yes, why was it limited to London?
Because London was by far the biggest fire brigade in the country, one of the biggest in the world, and had access to sufficient experience and data to make it feasible to do that.
But it would mean you had no comparables outside London, wouldn't it?
Well, it didn't exclude the possibility of looking outside.
Well, you say that, but looking at the words on the page, on a London basis, what did that mean?
Well, it was looking at the London experience, but that didn't preclude the possibility that the researchers would go to Manchester or West Midlands and ask them questions about whether their experience was similar, but
right.
which is a different way of getting contributions without having, as it were, a joint study.
Right. Had Commissioner Dobson told you to narrow the scope of the review down to London only?
No, he said almost the opposite, didn't he?
Right. Can we go to LFB 3084814? Now, if we go to the email at the bottom of this page, you can see it's an email of the 15th of January 2014 from you to Steve Turek and others, copied to Gary Reason. And the subject is RRO Review TOR. And you say, I think, but I'm not sure, that Neil was due to convene a meeting to discuss the terms of reference for the RRO review that was agreed at the last meeting of the Strategy Committee. In his absence, I've drafted something myself. Would you and yours please consider them, and we'll try to get together next week to discuss. Any comments before then would be welcome. Did you, and you attach a document and you ask for feedback, and then you go on to identify, yes, you requested feedback. Can we then go to the chain of emails at LFB 001000726? This is an email from you to Mark Andrews, the 5th of March 2014. Who was Mark Andrews?
Mark was a Deputy Assistant Commissioner in Fire Safety Regulations, so the tier below Steve Tyrek.
Right, I see. Fine. Now, you say, well, I should show you his, probably because you'd want to see it, but it's quite long. If you go to the bottom of page 1, Deputy Commissioner, you requested feedback on the RRO review. I've consulted with colleagues and commit the following points for consideration for our next meeting in regards to the scope of the review and what work we may have already been involved in. We've also included comments on the TOR, which is attached. And then over the page, you can see that, just to remind you, a 5-point list there. I show you that for context. Can we go back to page 1? You say, I'm afraid that there won't be another meeting to discuss scope. Members commissioned this work in November, and I've been consulting colleagues since January on the terms of reference, but without much success. This is the first substantive reply I've had. I really do not have more discussion with officers' time. As it is, I'm at serious risk from a member rebuke about how long it has already taken. Now just pausing there, why was it, from your perspective, that you weren't having much success with the review's terms of reference?
Why? Because others didn't attach the same importance to it as I did.
You then go on to identify two things. One, many of your comments on the terms of reference and below are things to contribute to the review. I don't think they shape the terms of reference, etc. And then the second one, in this version of the TOR, I've made it an objective not to shine a light on how FSR have discharged our RRO responsibilities. My impression, shared by other colleagues, is that Steve was very unhappy with the previous draft because it did more to shine a light on FSR than this version. My objective was to respond to his concerns, which I've done. Some of your comments would take me back. Why was it your objective not to shine a light on how FSR, in other words, your own Fire Safety Regulation Department, had not discharged the LFB's RRO responsibilities?
Because it wasn't intended, because that wasn't the intention of the study that we were attempting to initiate. I can see that. I can see those words might be suggestive that, well, in this context, they feel like misleading words, but.
Well, what did you mean?
The focus was on the RRO, and there is a list somewhere in the papers that we've been moving between here of the issues, and inevitably, I think they would have led into some commentary about how the Brigade discharged our responsibilities, but it simply wasn't the principal focus of the study. Of the intended study.
Well, you said, I have made it an objective to not shine a light on how FSR have discharged our RRO responsibilities. What else could you mean other than what is clear from those words?
Well, when you read on, you can see that Steve's response to an earlier draft was, this is more about the Fire Safety Regulation Department than it is about whether the RRO is an effective piece of legislation. Now, there's a relationship between those two things for sure, but they're not the same thing. And so, in that context, I feel that I can't remember the detail of Steve's comments, but it feels like they were useful, and I took them on board.
Did you consider that the FSR department had failed in discharging its RRO responsibilities in any respects?
No.
So if that was the case, there was nothing then to shine a light on.
That would be true.
So what was the problem?
It wasn't the objective to prove or disprove whether we were discharging our responsibilities in practice.
Oh, I see. So does it mean, and just trying to take that answer at face value, did it mean that you were reshaping the terms of reference so as to make the focus the defects in the legislation, but not with the intention of examining whether, and if so, how, the LFB had failed to comply with its RRO responsibilities? Is that a fair way of reading those words?
Well, that wasn't the design intent of those words, no. You're presenting it there as a kind of active decision to avoid scrutinising ourselves. And,
well, that's rather what it suggests. That's why I'm asking you.
That would be wrong. I'm not sure I can make a better explanation that it was about the legislative framework, not about our discharge of it. Although the two would have crossed over in some respects. But the discharge of the FSR functions was not what we were setting out to have a closer look at, and in one sense, there was a good deal of available information within the Brigade about the discharge of the FSR functions. So if you look at, for example, the quarterly monitoring reports to GPAC, I couldn't remember C yesterday, could I? Governance Performance Audit Committee. There was extensive information in those reports on a regular basis about the activity undertaken by the Fire Safety Regulation Department. So it wasn't my objective to scrutinise the work of the Fire Safety Regulation Department, although I'm not denying that the two have an important relationship.
Now you have mentioned this list of defects in the RRO that you perceived, both in your answer to the chairman a little while ago and now. Can we just look back then at the track change version of the draft fire safety legislation report at LFB 3086148? I just want to see if I can track down what you're referring to. Now, this is the most recent or most up-to-date draft, which I think was where the track changes were taken in and finalised. Is that right? There was no further?
I don't know.
You don't know. If we look at paragraph 3 on page 2 of that document, we can see a list of bullet points, questions, and the last line in the main paragraph says, questions might provide a good way to approach the task, and initially these could include, and then there's a long list of bullet points there. What are the fundamental principles of regulatory fire safety, etc.? Is that the list of defects that you had in mind?
It certainly includes some of them, but that's a longer list. So I don't think it was part of the terms of reference for the study to ask, for example, what are the fundamental principles of regulatory fire safety. So that statement, questions might provide a good way to approach the task. That was the task of, as it were, explaining to the committee, the strategy committee.
Right.
And you can see, I think, maybe the structure of the report then follows those.
Is there any document other than this document which sets out the list of defects in the RRO which you considered existed?
Possibly the terms of reference for the study itself,
right.
In the sense that we were saying to whoever we ended up appointing, these are the things we'd like you to examine further.
Now let's look on then at LFB 000087792.
Oh.
Now this is a tender for the study into the experience and the operation of the RRO in London method statement, dated the 19th of September 2014. So it's some 10 months after what you had taken to the strategy committee, and the start of the document in main is on page 3 under the heading background, And the text reads as follows. The London Fire and Emergency Planning Authority, the authority, has invited tenders for a study into the experience and the operation of the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order 2005 in London. Just pausing there, how was it that the Strategy Committee's RRO review had transitioned from what looked at the time to be an in-house review to one which was outsourced?
It was never an in-house review. I think the last document we looked at has introduced some confusion. So,
right.
The questions in those the bullet points that followed that statement, questions to be asked and answered, or whatever it said, was intended to point to the structure of that report. So as you go through that report, you'll find that, I hope, that each of those bullet points were addressed in the report. But it was never the intention that they would all be carried into the study. Some of them were, but that was never my intention.
Right. Why was it outsourced? Why was the study outsourced?
Because we wanted an external view. I think in local government, it's not unusual for a local authority to outsource a study or a piece of research into a function for which the body is responsible.
Now, it was the BRE, I think, who prepared the tender, didn't they?
No, they didn't prepare the tender. No, they responded to the tender.
I see.
So it was September 2014 because, from memory, this was the second time round. So we tendered it earlier that year, but didn't get any responses.
I follow. I'm so sorry. You're right. This is the response to your tender, but this is the tender. This is the tender document. This is their tender, effectively.
No,
the document itself records that the LFIPA had invited tenders.
Oh,
so
yes.
I'd rather assume that you'd published an invitation.
We had.
To which BRE had responded by submitting a tender.
Yes.
Yes, great. Thank you.
Yes, and this is the response.
Sorry,
to
so
that.
this is the. I'm sorry, I thought this was the tender document, as in the invitation, but it's not. You're saying it's the BRE response.
Yes, when I said they prepared the tender, that's because that's how they describe it.
Yes.
Tender for a study.
Okay.
So they are doing the tendering in response to your invitation.
Yes.
Yes. Now, if we go to yes. If we go to the last paragraph on this page 3, it says, it is understood that whilst not focusing solely on London, the review should necessarily call extensively on the London experience. The findings and recommendations from the authorities' Lakanal House Working Group, LHWG, will provide input to the project. Was your report on the operation and efficacy of the fire safety legislative landscape the first of the two reports given to the Strategy Committee on the 12th of November 2013, provided to the BRE for the purposes of their tender?
Probably, but I'm not certain.
Who put the invitation to tender together? Do you know?
The procurement department, with contributions from Fire Safety, Public Affairs, and myself.
Right. Is it right that the BRE's report? Well, sorry, who won the tender?
BRE. I'm not sure there were any other tenders.
Well, that was my next question. You don't think there were any others?
I don't think there were.
The BRE. Right. Did anybody ever conduct an investigation into how independent the BRE was from government for this purpose?
No.
Why is that?
I think I understood that they were independent from government.
But no one explored that question.
I didn't explore it because I thought I believed that they were.
Yes. I mean, I'm not making a point one way or the other. I'm not making any point. I'm just asking you whether anybody ever asked the question or thought to examine the question.
Well, BRE as an organisation weren't aliens to the London Fire Brigade, and we understood that, there were different divisions. So it's a big organisation with different divisions, and has some trading functions, and it has research functions, it has testing functions. It has a wide range of functions, and I think they have different governance arrangements for different aspects of their activities.
I think it's right, isn't it, that the BRE's report wasn't finalised before you were made redundant in March 2015?
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, that's correct.
Yes, and the date we have for it, I think, is the 9th of September 2015. And I'll just provide the reference. I don't think there's any need to show you it. It's at LFB 3046812. Now, I take it that you never saw any early version of that before you left? No. Now, I'm going to move on to some different questions which we picked up very briefly earlier about the audit tool from January 2015. But I've got an eye on the clock, Mr. Chairman, and I certainly won't finish the topic before 4:30. Might that be a convenient moment?
Well, I think if you're going to a new topic, yes, it would. How are you getting on with the witness in terms of timing? I mean?
Yes, very well. I would think that, looking at what I have left, we will finish before, I hesitate to say comfortably, before lunch on Monday.
Right.
Even allowing for the break for follow-up questions, which I should just say, I'm hoping that those listening who have follow-up questions will take the advantage of tomorrow to provide them to us rather than...
Well, that would be very helpful, I'm sure.
It would be helpful, but it wouldn't be my experience. But
well, you live in hope.
So, that would be helpful. I would think that we will finish comfortably, possibly comfortably, but certainly by lunchtime on Monday.
Right. Thank you very much. Well, now, the bad news, so to speak, Mrs. Dexter, is that I'm afraid we are going to have to ask you to come back on Monday. I think, actually, you probably had Monday in your diary anyway, didn't you?
And Tuesday, so
and
it still
Tuesday.
feels
Well,
like
then the good news is that we shouldn't need you on Tuesday.
Indeed.
But anyway, you've heard what Mr. Millett had to say. There's a real possibility that you'll be able to be free by lunchtime on Monday. But as it is, we'll stop at this point. We'll resume at 10 o'clock on Monday morning. And as before, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence or anything to do with it over the weekend. There's quite a temptation, I think, when there are several days break. Or at least it's not a temptation, at least an opportunity. And if the opportunity arises, please resist it. All right? Good. Well, thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, before we rise, I just want to ask the witness a process question, if I may. I've been reminded helpfully from behind, and it's been the subject of discussion with those representing the LFB during the course of the afternoon, and it relates to the report which the witness said a number of times in her evidence today existed, which reported to the board or a board about the information flow between the 72D group, as it were, and the RRO group. And when I asked the witness this afternoon, she told us that it was part of her evidence bundle. Both we and the LFB's RLRs would like very much to identify that document. The best way of doing that, rather than provoking discussions between the witness and the LFB's lawyers, which I'm very keen to avoid, is to ask the witness publicly now, through you, Mr. Chairman, if she wouldn't mind, because she has access to the documents, finding the document and telling the inquiry the URN, the reference number, and copying in the LFB solicitors at the same time. If that's difficult for the witness, then I'd like to know.
Let's just take it by stages. First question, I think, Mr. Dexter, is do you have access to the bundle of documents which you referred to, which I think was probably given to you for preparatory purposes? Do you still have access to that?
I believe I do. I have many different categories of bundles, but I think I've got a pretty fair recollection of where I find it.
Right. Well, my next question was going to be, do you have the means to search and find that document?
I think I clearly remember where it is.
Right. Well,
I hope I'm not wrong about that.
I'm sorry to ask you to do this, but I think it would be a great help to us if you could identify that document in your bundle. At the bottom right-hand corner, there should be a unique reference number, which will tie into our relativity database. And it would help us, I think, if you could send an email to the solicitor for the inquiry. Do you have the address? Well, we'll make sure. We
can provide that. I think that by way of exception, we can provide that to the witness and copy to...
And ask you to send us an email identifying that document by its URN, and copy the solicitors representing the LFB into that email, so they've also got the same information and also can see what's in the message. Would you mind doing that?
No, of course not. But may I ask you a question?
Yes, of course.
I can't remember whether there's a URN number in the bottom right-hand corner or not. So if there isn't a URN, so I'm certain it's been provided through my legal team. But
can I suggest that if you, I'd be extremely surprised if you couldn't find a URN, because all the documents will have been pulled off our database and everything on it's got a URN. But if there's a difficulty, send us an email saying, sorry, I can't find the URN or whatever, and then we will respond and give you whatever help we can to identify the document.
Okay.
I hope it won't take up too much of your time to do that, but I'd be very grateful.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right.
And thank you, Ms. Dexter, for that.
Thank you very much. We'll look forward to seeing you on Monday at 10 o'clock.
Thank you.
Thank you. Right, thank you very much. 10 o'clock on Monday.
Thank you.
Thank you.